This is C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. This week, Wall Street Journal technology reporter Jeff Horwitz discusses his book, Broken Code Inside Facebook and the Fight to Expose Its Harmful Secrets. He speaks about Facebook's growth as a company and the challenges its platforms have faced. He's interviewed by Bloomberg News reporter Sarah Fryer.
We assume you're here because you enjoy listening to C-SPAN's podcast. If you're a regular listener, please consider supporting our nonprofit operations so we can continue to bring you quality public affairs podcasts like these. Visit cspan.org/donate to learn more.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
Jeff, thank you so much. I'm so glad we have the opportunity to talk about this today. And I really want to start by bringing our viewers back to fall of 2021, when you released the Facebook Files and a series of stories that really sparked this global conversation about the company and how a lot of what it was communicating to the public was not how it was working internally. Can you take us back to that moment in those stories and what that was like?
Yeah, sure. So, the book came out of initially the documents that were provided to us by Frances Haugen, a former Facebook employee who, in her final months at the company, began talking with the Journal and documenting some of the things that she was concerned about internally. And she ended up taking more than 20,000 screenshots of internal work product. And that was kind of the basis for the Facebook Files. And the stuff covered just kind of a really wide range of how Facebook interacted with society, from like the special dispensations it gave to powerful individuals on the account on the platform to violate its rules and not get punished, to teen mental health and Instagram issues, to sort of the company's failure to combat human trafficking on its platform until Apple threatened to remove its apps from the App Store unless it did something about it, to COVID. And so there was kind of a pretty, and then also to politics, right? How the platform changed the tenor of political conversations worldwide by favoring really vitriolic, kind of firebrand content over sort of more moderate voices. So all of that was like kind of this big mass of documents that we got, and that sort of suggested the company was far from the neutral platform that Facebook Meta had always spoken of it as. And I think that was kind of the basis of that stuff. Obviously, those documents ended up going to Congress and to a whole bunch of other news outlets as well in the end. And from there, I think the goal was to write a book that both went deeper into those records than a newspaper could ever do, and also that explained the story of how it came to be. Because Frances Haugen only touched on a small piece of her work, was only a tiny piece of the overall sort of collection of information. And I kind of wanted to write the story of how Facebook came to be aware of its role in the world and how it affected human interaction and in some instances distorted it. And, kind of the people who made those discoveries and the internal fight to try to get Facebook to address some of the things that its own safety staff discovered.
The thing that is so stunning about all of this is not just what you were able to reveal through those documents, but also just the contrast, the constant contrast between how Facebook was presenting itself and its goals to the public and what it was doing behind the scenes. So can you paint a picture for us of like what things Facebook says, what now the company is called Meta, but what does Zuckerberg say about the company's goals and about its attention to these difficult problems? And how does that contrast with what you've seen behind the scenes?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the things that sort of paved the way for the difficulty Facebook had after 2016 and sort of the internal reckoning was that they had
the 2016 presidential election where Trump won.
Is that they'd been Pollyanna-ish about the platform's role in the world. The idea was that they were going to connect everyone and that it was going to make the world better in every possible way. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg at one point talked about how the spread of Facebook would literally end terrorism in the Middle East because, young disaffected youth that were online and were connected via social networks to, young disaffected youth on the other side would lose the capacity to hate, right? Obviously, that didn't work out very well. And so they kind of just had this, like, everything's going to be great all the time expectation. I think they didn't put much work into safety at the beginning. It was just kind of, we'll deal with the worst possible stuff. If it breaks the law and it comes to our attention, then we'll take it down. But they didn't really do much on that front. And I think one of the things that was really important here was that the company was in the, for basically the last decade was sort of leaning heavier and heavier into algorithmic recommendation systems. The platform stopped being kind of the original version of Facebook and social media, where kind of you just followed your friends and you saw the things they posted, and it became much more heavy on recommendations. And as you know, this is true of Instagram as well. And so they started taking a more active role in promoting content, but they never really liked the idea that they were responsible for what they promoted. The whole idea was that the platform was completely neutral, that Mark Zuckerberg, wanted humans to be completely out of the loop. But at the same time, I think one of the things that the safety staff found was that not making choices about what content thrives in your platform and what content you promote is still making a choice, right? It was turned out to be very easy to game the platform, that bad actors, didn't matter if they were Russians or Macedonian high school students or, just about anybody who was committed could pretty easily game the algorithm. And they just sort of, I think they just didn't assume, I mean, for a company that set out to change the world, right, which was kind of Facebook's thing, they, to some degree, were shockingly unprepared for actually changing it. If that makes sense.
Right. It seems to me that, just from your book and also from my own conversations, they have this idea that, as people become connected, they generate empathy, they'll build friendships, that all connection is good and all conversation is good as an extension of that, right? And as you lay out in many cases with Facebook groups, with recommendations for who to follow on Instagram, with virality in itself, like often those recommendations or just giving the people what they want turns into disaster or harm. Can you give us a few examples?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I actually would question a little bit one thing you said there, which is that it's giving the people what they want, right? They have this like extremely rudimentary system in some ways for determining what people want. It's like called, if you get a response, then send more of whatever got a response, right? Unless like literally seeing a post cause people to close out of the platform, if they respond in any fashion, that's a good thing. And,
engagement is the industry term for that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so, and I think one of the really interesting things is that they did user surveys, and very clearly the users wanted them to do far more to address misinformation, to, reduce kind of disturbing content, to address clickbait and engagement bait efforts to just basically game the system, to boost more reliable news over, fly-by-night publishers that were either making things up or just, stealing other people's work and making it more aggressive. like users wanted this stuff, and they told the company that in no uncertain terms. But at the same time, the engagement metric, right, which is like, do they use the product for more and longer? That was always what the company trusted as what users really wanted, right? And I think that was to some degree, it's a pretty unfortunate choice, and one that does disrespect people's actually stated choice. It's like, you say you don't want this, but you can't turn your eyes away. So clearly you do want it, right? And that's I don't think a particularly healthy approach or a respectful approach, if that makes sense, to users.
Right. We've seen some lawmakers compare social media to fast food or cigarettes or sugar. What comparison do you have in your mind, and how did you think about it as you're working on this book, about really something that people have grappled with on social media for so many years? What do you think you bring to the conversation that moves it forward here? I want to let people know why they should take a look.
Tall order. But that said, I would say that what I'm trying to bring to the conversation is, first of all, a sense that social media isn't just like some monolithic thing that was invented and now, exists like electricity or, anything else. Like these are like, what happens on a platform depends very heavily on the design choices made and the motivations of the people who are building it. And that there is a lot of control. I think something that the company historically has always really shied away from is explaining what its core mechanics are and why they were designed that way, right? Like, I mean, how many times have you heard the phrase, we connect you with the people and things you love, or like,
Sure.
Kind of these extremely vague things that acknowledge that there's a lot going on, but don't really say what the company was doing. And I think that a lot of the choices, when you start looking at them a little more closely, start looking, I would say, somewhat morally suspect. Is it just because people tend to respond to vitriolic political stuff, does that mean you should send them more vitriolic political stuff? I think that's not something that I think is an obvious yes, but it always was at Meta. Likewise, I think some of the design changes that they've made, things like allowing people to invite literally thousands of people into groups per day, like send bulk invites to thousands of people. The safety researchers did plenty of work on this. They were finding that, the speed at which Facebook groups grew made them completely ungovernable. If, even a well-intentioned group administrator couldn't possibly keep up. And in some instances, you had literally a single user that invited 400,000 people into a QAnon conspiracy group over the course of 4 months, right? Like, anything, I think the company had a hard time suggesting or accepting that there might be anything that was such a thing as bad usage, right? Other than like kind of the most obvious spam and fake account stuff. Beyond that, if people wanted to use the platform to, try to manipulate public opinion, if people wanted to, sort of build hyper-aggressive, almost, misinformation-based social movements, that was something that the company just didn't really want to touch.
Talk to us a little bit about, ever since Elon Musk acquired Twitter, turned it into X, there has been this drumbeat, and even before that with Facebook, this drumbeat of people calling for, free speech. Like, Facebook shouldn't manipulate what we think and see and do. And I guess what I'm gathering from what you're saying is there was never a world in which Facebook didn't manipulate what we see and think and do. Can you explain that a little bit to those who might not understand how algorithms work, how recommendations work, that there is no natural neutral?
Yeah, I think, look, there is a natural neutral, which is called Facebook in 2004. People post things and you can visit other people's profiles and you can look and see what they posted, right? after that, things start getting a lot more complicated. And I think, the conversation that we had about social media for a lot of years was based, pretty much limited to like, what should they take down, right? Is this such a bad thing that it needs to get removed? So it was just kind of this binary censorship type question. That doesn't really account for how the platform works. As you were saying, the way that, the way that things that posts make it into people's feeds, whether that's Instagram or Facebook, that is a combination of design choices, in terms of, what the company believes users are most likely to do. And then just kind of some straight algorithmic black box work in which literally you are turning over to a computer the goal of maximizing engagement, however it sees fit. And so it'll serve whatever content it predicts is most likely to yield engagement. One thing that they did, I think very intentionally, was dial up virality, right? They constantly made the platform faster. They constantly, tried to make it easier for, just sort of massive amounts of activity. I think one thing in the book that like really touches on kind of where, not everything's algorithm, right? Like where the company went wrong was it was the friending team, right? So this is a team that's responsible for trying to increase the number of connections people make on the platform. Reasonable goal in principle. Problem is they realized that for several years the way they'd been hitting their targets was by encouraging people who were already friending more than 50 people a day to friend even more people, right? And like as soon as I read that, or I suspect as soon as like anyone hears that, they would think, oh God, nobody makes legitimately 50 friends a day on a regular basis. Like what sort of activity are you actually boosting? Because they had,
like spam.
It sure sounds like it, right? I just have a hard time. Maybe, theoretically one person could one day after joining Facebook, brand new, find 50 people they know and friend them all. But like, that's a one-time thing, like the quality of connection, and that's something that theoretically Facebook was supposed to be working on. The quality of connection is obviously going to be trash if you're sending out 100 invites per day. And the company, though, just didn't want to hear it, even when its own staff was raising this. And so, there's a combination of two things, right? One is the algorithm, because there's the people, people you may know was what it turns out they were recommending the people who send 100x friend requests a day, because guess what? Those people accept every friend request they get. So there's the algorithmic part of it, but then there's also the design choice, which is like, should you really be able to send out hundreds of friend requests per day? Meta could never bring itself to say, maybe that's unhealthy growth.
And these metrics matter for a couple of reasons to Facebook, right? First being, if you're on the friend team trying to make more friend connections, maybe if you hit that goal, that number, you get a bonus, you get a raise, you get promoted. And two, if you create more connections for people on Facebook, more content is eligible to show up in their newsfeed, which then makes for more slots for potential advertising, which is Facebook's whole cash cow. Correct? Yeah,
and I think that was another thing that was really fascinating to realize, was just how much users were being manipulated into certain types of behavior, right? They would also try to manipulate users into posting more, by, say, for example, showing them when they were launching Reels, they would try to show people 5 or 6 versions of videos in a row, the same audio being used in different videos in a row, because that increased the number of times that people then went out and used that same audio, right? It was like they were trying to basically create an impression of extreme popularity and get people to join on the bandwagon. And so, like, I think
that's so interesting.
Yeah, the metrics are all important to that company, right? If you can't measure it as a problem, it doesn't exist. Is I think a frequent complaint of a lot of the people who were trying to argue for kind of more interventions and more ways to mitigate some of the known issues. And so, they would just whatever was going to hit the numbers, they would kind of bang on that drum. And to some degree, I think it makes sense, right? The move fast and break things ethos that the company had early on was kind of the reason why it beat out its other competitors, is that like if something was going to increase usage, they would just hammer on it until the number went up. And they never really sort of lost that approach, even after they were running something that I think by their own acknowledgement was a near indispensable public utility, right? Something that people relied on around the world to have conversations and to, discover information. They were still running it as if they were just trying to get the quarterly number up.
And after 2016 presidential election, which we talked about earlier, where Facebook realized that there was manipulation on the platform by state actors like Russia, where they pledged to do more. Zuckerberg goes on this cross-country tour where he's basically a politician and promises that he's really about building community and empathy. That 2018 year, that's when Frances Haugen joins. And why does she join Facebook?
Yeah, so I think Frances is a fascinating human being and a remarkable source. This is a story that, like, candidly, the people at Meta had a hard time believing because it was so, like, almost like scripted good. And candidly, I did too. When I first met her and heard all about this stuff, I was like, I think this person's gilding the lily. I had to do a lot of research. So her background is that she had a friend who was radicalized on the internet. And it wasn't Meta's platforms that did it. But this guy went from, sort of being shall we say, he went down a rabbit hole that began with politics and ended up with some version of white nationalism and the singularity, which is when computers overtake human beings as, the more intelligent and dominant force. It was all very weird, but point being is this guy just lost his marbles, actually by his own admission. I tracked him down later. And so Facebook had tried to recruit her for years because, that's not a sign that she was like necessarily the most valuable person in the world. It was just that this was a company that had an insatiable appetite for anyone who was good at data science and sort of had a track record of being able to do this sort of work. They were doubling in size every 18 months. So she finally basically bit on a recruiting offer and told them that because of her friend and having the experience of having lost a friend to radicalization, she wanted to work on misinformation. She wanted to work on that sort of stuff. And so she was like very transparent about why she was coming in, which is that, she believed that social media was potentially a risk and that she needed to address it or needed to do her part to address it. And she then spent a couple of years, I think, growing increasingly disillusioned because, one of the things that anyone going through Meta's internal documents will realize is that a lot of the problems that the company describes as being intractable are ones that there were, in fact, plans drawn up for to address. And the plan wasn't like to censor everybody, right? Like it wasn't, this wasn't a kind of a free speech based thing. If anything, I think the people who did integrity work, safety work at the company really tried to get away from individual content calls. The whole idea was maybe you make things a little less viral. Maybe you are more careful with what you recommend. In other words, if you recommend something, it has to not be bad news, right? You have to be confident of that. And if you can't be confident of that, maybe you shouldn't be recommending content. These were things that the company just simply wouldn't do. And I think, a thing that was always frustrating to the people who did integrity work was there were clearly trade-offs between growth and integrity, right? After a certain point, the only way for the company to maximize usage was to sort of start encouraging less healthy behaviors, whether that was like consuming a ton of like body image related content for young women, or whether that was like encouraging people to like join 400 rabid political groups on Facebook, that many of which were run by overseas actors. There was always sort of, it turned out the way the company was hitting its growth targets was like frequently had a dark side, and the company did not want to listen to that.
So they did have all these smart people working on these problems, proposing solutions, but every time that would trickle up to the top, they would get shut down essentially. And that's why Francis wanted to talk to you.
This was true everywhere, but like, and I had a hard time believing this at first when I saw these stats that essentially anything that damaged growth or daily usage. And when I say damaged, I mean literally reduced by 0.05%. That was dead on arrival. You could not change the platform in ways that reduce usage. That was just simply not allowed ever. And in fact, as Facebook's growth slowed, those rules got even more stringent, right? Like anything that would decrease any metric that was related to usage was just dead on arrival. The company talked about hard trade-offs, right, between various things, but the one thing that it never traded off was its own growth. And, that's, I think, a pretty challenging environment to work in. And I think one of the reasons why not just Francis, but a whole bunch of other employees got disaffected and walked. I think to some degree, the book that I wrote was only possible because Facebook, Meta, brought in a whole bunch of extremely smart people, told them to work on things that were clearly societally important, where lives were at stake. Asked them for solutions. They came up with solutions, and then Meta said, thanks, but we don't really want to do that. And, you break people that way. It's like one thing if, your boss doesn't want to take your opinion about, how to boost ad sales by a fraction of a percent. It's another thing when, your boss is like unwilling to do things that might address the mental health and well-being of teenagers, or a genocide in Myanmar, or the safety of the U.S. elections. Those are things that I think, understandably, people had a really hard time being told to stand down on.
And when all of this information came out in fall of 2021, did the company then acknowledge that it's been, making these missteps?
It was interesting. They almost started to acknowledge with teen mental health there were problems, and I think they determined that that was not a good strategy. This was, I think, a very calculated decision, and some of the emails that have come out since in various state litigation seems to demonstrate that, is that, they said it was all cherry-picked and misrepresented, and the work, the research documents that we'd obtained, they kind of threw the researchers under the bus and said that the research wasn't very good, and, wasn't credible.
I remember that.
No, the people internally, even senior people, seem to acknowledge the reality of this stuff. You have, Instagram's former head of policy, stating that the platform just simply wasn't built for younger teens, and that, it was going to be harmful. You have, people saying, oh my God, we're putting these AI-based beauty filters on, which, we're offering these up. They make both the people who post pictures in which their appearance is sort of improved, and the people who see those pictures feel worse about themselves. But you know what? People use them, so let's do it. They
and
really
that,
did
by the way,
have
just came out in some attorney general
exactly
unsealed documents.
Yeah, and I think they really did have a sense of the potential harms, but they obviously did not respond well to having their documents made public. And the company was, said that it was, that other companies might, dial back on research under those circumstances, but it certainly wouldn't. And there is no question that that was not true. Reporting in the book, because it turns out people kept on providing me documents, demonstrated that that they were just cracking down massively on what researchers could say, on how they could express themselves. I mean, one thing that I loved is they made very clear that at no point should an employee ever note that the company might be breaking the law or doing something unethical. You
At
should
least not in
never put
writing.
that in writing because it might be misconstrued, right? And so, I think there was kind of in some ways, it's been really gratifying to see some of the state AG stuff come out because, I think a lot of the pushback the company gave when the Facebook files first came out, like, it's nice to be able to see that internally they didn't believe it either.
How does it feel, as a reporter with all of these employees who risked a lot? They've signed NDAs, they've had these professional relationships to come and talk to you and say, please put this out there in the public. I want to see something happen, and then get that company response. How do you even wrap your head around that as a journalist?
From my point of view as a reporter, it's good. This is basically Meta almost radicalizing its own staff by,
because more people will come talk to you.
Yeah, well, exactly. When your company is saying, "Oh no, that research doesn't exist, we don't believe it," and everyone knows otherwise on your staff, you're really creating a kind of a delta between reality and the company's position. And I think that employees tend to not respond well to that. So to some degree, that has resulted in continued internal sourcing from that company. But I mean, I think, look, this too from your work. And incidentally, I should probably note here, and there's actually a whole questions I want to ask you about No Filter, but my interrogator here did write the definitive book on Instagram's rise and its tenure, early tenure at Meta, and early to mid tenure, I'd say. I guess if I can briefly turn the table here, I guess I would want to ask if, I guess in terms of sort of the things that, because I wasn't even covering Meta, I think, in a lot of the time when you were, covering Instagram and doing really good work there. I would love to know a bit sort of how you think the Meta product philosophy shaped Instagram in particular, given that is of Meta's platforms, arguably still the hottest and most culturally relevant.
Well, I think one thing that just sort of the big shock in my book as I was reporting it out is that, despite what we know about how driven Mark Zuckerberg is towards growth and how much he cares about accelerating that in any way possible, Instagram had a lot of opportunities to grow that Zuckerberg didn't want to pursue because he thought that it would cannibalize Facebook's growth. Yeah. So tied into all of these ambitions is also a lot of ego around being an inventor, being a technologist, being the one who solves the problem and makes the product that wins. Kevin Systrom, the founder of Instagram, ultimately left the company, as did his co-founder, Mike Krieger. Same thing happened with the co-founders of WhatsApp. This way that they were growing their products, where they didn't want growth for the sake of manipulating people, because they thought that would be low quality growth. That was just not something that philosophy didn't mesh well. The simplicity of an app. And now I think that Instagram is pretty much just another version of Facebook. It's like Facebook with a different skin. All the data is connected. All of the algorithmic modeling is connected, messaging. Yep. And the platform itself is getting a whole lot more complicated, much as Facebook has over the years, and diluting its power. And so even though it continues to grow, I think that it is losing that meaning. And I think you and I would probably agree on this fault of the grow at all costs philosophy, which is that at a certain point, when you give people more of what the data shows they engage with, the quality of the content that they see degrades. Even if you have people befriending more people, then you as an individual don't want to share as many meaningful things. And that could actually hurt the platform's growth in a way. And that's why they had to turn now to Reels.
Yeah, I think that this is actually a really good point, and one that also does come up in the book, is that the company just found itself deeply uncomfortable ever considering questions of quality. And to some degree, I think it alienated a lot of the entities that, made it succeed. And this especially goes for Instagram, right? They never had any appreciation for original content. I mean, they said they did, right? The way to succeed in the platform was to post good original content. That's actually not correct. Everyone internally understood that the way you succeed on the platform is to steal content from other sources, possibly even other Facebook users that has already succeeded. Because once something went viral, it would almost certainly go viral again. And so, rather than rewarding people who were actually creating culture, right, as the Instagram, sort of motto goes, they rewarded people who, paid freelancers in Bangladesh $20 to compile dirt bike accidents, right? And I think it was a very hard thing to explain to creators who were earnestly trying to produce good material for the platform. Why they should do that when, they were just getting slaughtered by kind of cheesy algorithm amplification tactics, right? I think from a lot of people internally were just sort of screaming, hey, stop. You're basically in the process of killing the golden goose. And they never listened to that. The top posts on the platform were frequently pretty vile. There is a scene in the book in which I have to think how to phrase this one. It is a close-up of someone's exposed nude posterior is the top post on Facebook for an entire day. They just didn't even notice, right? Because they didn't pay attention to content quality. At some point there's kind of a piper to pay there. And I think, I'm sure some of your sources from Instagram would say that they probably are paying it to some degree, that in the cultural relevance and kind of the future of the app, that they've taken a hit. Am I wrong about that?
I don't think you're wrong. I think in order to drive culture, you need to have people who are doing something that others are following or envious of. And, young people aren't going to join a platform aspiring to be the person who compiled the videos of viral bike accidents, right? They want to join TikTok to be the next Charlie D'Amelio. So I think that when Facebook tries to replicate and Instagram tries to replicate what's worked elsewhere, they're missing that secret sauce of the original content creators that drive culture and make a difference, and it could be killing them. What does your Facebook feed look like right now?
Oh God, you don't want to ask that. I've been doing work related to child safety recently,
okay.
And so the work that I've been doing to do that is hideous. Likewise, the work related to the 2024 elections. I think this is something that is just profoundly sad to me, is that to some degree, things haven't changed since 2016. It is still a successful tactic for overseas content farms to post videos of, stolen content, shocking content, we're talking people with deformities, literally parasitic worms coming out of their skin, things that are just kind of hideous to look at. You can build up a huge audience that way. And then they'll run overlapping pages that promote this stuff. And so, I think something I have to remind myself of from time to time is that as a person who researches the platform, it doesn't all look like this. But at the same time, clearly this stuff is wildly popular. It's, you can get 500,000 followers on Facebook very easily by just like posting awful contents of or awful videos of people presumably dying in car accidents, right? That is a really successful strategy still. And to some degree, I think the platform is just sort of still open for business for anyone who has, half a brain and the will to manipulate it.
What are your concerns looking ahead to the 2024 presidential election, given that we know a lot of these problems haven't been solved, that a lot of the same viral mechanics are at play, plus the new addition of the AI ingredient?
Yeah. To some degree, AI isn't new for the platform, right? I understand the AI generated content is kind of a bit of the focus, but the idea that you have AI systems that are just acting in chaotic, unpredictable ways and promoting weird stuff, that's, Facebook sort of pioneered that. I think one concern I've got for US and 2024, and any other election is that the company has never really confronted or settled permanently the question of whether it is okay for a domestic actor to attempt to manipulate the algorithm by, whether it's by promoting the same content from 50 different accounts simultaneously, which, is a known problem that causes the algorithm to think it's actually really popular when it's just being posted by one guy with 50 accounts. Or whether it's, sort of certain types of content that seem to be extremely good at riling people up, things that, the company internally refers to as hate bait. They've never really figured out how to deal with things that are coming from US actors now, right? If it's like the Russians, yeah, okay, they'll take them down, right? And they will issue a press release. But if it's a super PAC or, some sort of political party or there are technically rules against it, but they don't necessarily enforce them in any way that would be a deterrent, if that makes sense. And so I do have some concern that we've kind of moved on from kind of the core of the platform to AI, and AI, a generative AI is kind of the concern. I do think that some of the core mechanics issues that just sort of remain unresolved are still pretty scary. Particularly, the company's issued a ruling saying that, at this point, you can say the 2020 election was stolen. You can't say the 2024 election will be stolen necessarily currently. But this is one of those things where they're splitting hairs in a way where it's very easy to think about how you're going to have the exact same sort of thing that led to Stop the Steal. And to some degree that drove the drumbeat of attention that preceded January 6th. It's going to be very easy for someone to do that again if they so choose.
Or even have a coded phrase like "Stop the Steal" that isn't specifically I think the election was stolen, but
yeah, exactly. And so and so I think that's a thing, is that they've always really tried to focus on just purely rules-based enforcement. Meta wants to live in a world where the only choice they ever make is, do we take things down or do we kind of quietly suppress them via automated systems. And I think that the platform at this point has certainly grown into, both platforms really have grown into curatorial functions. And I think there is they haven't really addressed the problem that whoever screams loudest wins. And they seem to be really reluctant to take that on as a challenge.
So, okay. The other factor at play, of course, is that Meta has different stated priorities now, right? The company is called Meta now. It's all about AI and the metaverse. They barely spoke about any of these issues on their most recent earnings call.
Yep.
Does that concern you? I mean, that plus the recent layoffs, the sort of restructuring of the company.
Oh yeah, they've
How
moved
does that
on.
play into 2024?
They have absolutely moved on from governing the platforms. I mean, I think you're totally right about there was a period of time in which Instagram's growth was almost seen as threatening to Mark Zuckerberg because, Facebook was the thing he cared about. I think it would be very hard to make the case that Mark Zuckerberg is deeply concerned about Facebook in any way other than that it continue to perform because that's still the workhorse for money, right? That's where like
Right.
60% plus of revenue is coming from still is the blue app. Um, but I mean, he's kind of said as much, right? That they'll continue to do some things on it, but like as you note, they have slashed a lot of staff there, and they moved a whole bunch of people first into virtual reality and then into sort of generative AI related work. I mean, I think very clearly the core platforms that still account for like high 90% of revenues just aren't that interesting anymore to them. And there is an element of neglect here, certainly on the safety front. I think there's an element where, like, to some degree, the Facebook files kind of accelerated this. They were already starting to treat researchers and data scientists who were looking at societal issues as a potential fifth column. And I think Frances Haugen, to some degree, made clear that there was a portion of the company that seemed to be more loyal to their principles than they were to the company. And I think that's a very dangerous thing if you're Meta potentially. And so,
Yeah.
they got rid of a lot of people. And I think that, it's kind of hard to see how the company would perform much better, given that it hasn't addressed some of the design issues and yet it has cut some of the staff, right? The civic team doesn't exist anymore. So much for that.
So you see the cracks forming. You see this neglect of the main platform, neglect of potentially even Instagram, dependence on those platforms to still grow so that Zuckerberg can pursue these other goals. I just looked up the stock returns for this year. It's up 176% so far.
Absolutely.
So more than doubled by a lot. Do you think that there is ever a moment of reckoning that will actually change Facebook? Do you think that these returns, like what does that mean to you when you see governments trying to push back and the company is still thriving?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that I think that the pushback so far has been pretty limited, right? I mean, in the US, there was on child safety in particular, there was back in 2021, there were a lot of hearings. There was the promise of legislation coming soon. There was bipartisan agreement. Some of this stuff was really problematic. Nothing ever happened. In the EU, you do have the Digital Services Act and a little more in the terms of in the way of regulatory action happening over there. But I do think that right now it's pretty muted. And I think that, to some degree, the stock price reflects that recommending content in as aggressive a fashion as possible and then running ads next to it is still a truly fantastic business. The externalities are not ones that are captured by the stock price, if that makes sense. And I think something that is really notable is that the company really has kind of dropped a lot of the ideological mission that, they initially pursued. Like, I think, back in the day, people used to pride themselves on they wouldn't consider the revenue impact of things, right? It was all supposed to be about what was best for the user, what increased usage, right? And I think, again, what increased usage and what was best for the user is sometimes perhaps not as overlapping as the company would like to think, as we discussed earlier. But like the whole idea was you don't talk about money. Well, I mean, this year we have had the year of efficiency, right? Where Mark Zuckerberg has cut around a quarter of all staff, even though the margin that they're running is, it's always been around the 40% range, right? This is a truly incredible business. There is no shortage of resources yet, all the same. And I think one of the things that's fascinating to me is that, Mark Zuckerberg has sole control of the company, right? If he wants to spend more on safety work, or he wants to do something that might not be in the near term growth interest of growth, he absolutely can. He set up the company in that way. But I think the interesting thing is that it seems like they don't want to, right? Like they are now into making money as an activity, and making money and funding basically new product bets. The actual kind of, we're going to connect people and make the world a better place, I think they've sort of withdrawn from that territory to some degree.
Why do you think so? I mean, do you think that one of my theories is just like the stock falling in 2021 was a real shock to the system. They'd grown and grown and grown, and that was the first year that they really had a revenue shortfall, and everyone freaked out, and employees saw their net worth drop, and now they realize what they care about more. Or do you have another theory? I mean, what is the reason that Meta is sort of abandoning its do-gooder, external-facing narrative?
There are a few things that have occurred that I think are notable. One of them is, if you notice, the leadership team has just contracted over and over again. In particular, a lot of women have left, Sheryl Sandberg being the most notable, but there are a lot of them. And I think at this point, it tends to be a group of people that are extremely loyal to Mark, and tend to be advocates for his approach. So I think to some degree, internal discussion and debate has really taking a hit over the last few years. This is a very much a Mark Zuckerberg production, right? And I think it is, obviously my sense is that it's not that there's a concern as much that Mark Zuckerberg's personal net worth is falling too much at any point. It's that to some degree, there's a belief that if the company's stock isn't doing well, then it won't be able to attract talent. And if it can't attract talent, then it can't build the next big thing. And so, I think it's interesting because this is a company that was set up supposed to be kind of immune to stock price concerns. But at the end of the day, it seems like it's acting,
it tracks very closely with morale.
Yeah. Exactly.
And attractiveness in Silicon Valley. So when you see these dynamics at play, we also see that it looks like the metaverse isn't really catching, right at the end of your book, that the metaverse, it's not super clear if anybody wants that. And then
I'd say it's starting to get super clear whether anybody wants that. But if you notice,
if that's
there's
the future,
a lot more
where's this company going?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of one of the fascinating things, right? Is that the engine of this company is still Facebook and Instagram. Again, the revenue breakdowns we've seen: 60% Facebook, 40% Instagram. Instagram growing a little better than Facebook, but it's actually even greater than that. I think it might have been 65% Facebook. It's they have this legacy product that is certainly not the center of attention anymore, other than in the most sort of execution-based, let's continue, we got to keep growth going sort of way. I think the metaverse stuff, I'm not saying that virtual reality is not still the future, but it has an uncanny knack of being the future and never becoming the present. I think, the Meta rebranding and kind of the focus on launching Horizon Worlds, which was their kind of metaverse showcase, it just really didn't go well. One of my colleagues, Megan Bobrowski, spent a few days in the metaverse, and we got some internal usage statistics as well. For a company that has global ambitions and was talking about how the metaverse would soon be at 1 billion users, Horizon Worlds is kind of all but defunct. Very clearly they didn't get that right. Obviously now they're very focused on generative AI, but then again, so is everyone, right? I think there is an element of this where some of it does come down to Mark and seeking a legacy. Like, as you know, there was a point in time when, he was actually doing public polling. He had a pollster that was asking
Oh,
members
they're
of the
not still
public
doing that? I love those polls.
yeah, whether Mark Zuckerberg was an innovator, right, was
Yes,
like
yes, we
a
wrote about
question
that
on
at
the
Bloomberg.
poll, and so it's like kind of a very weird little uh, yeah, I think there is to some degree a legacy question that he's working on, and right now it seems like it's less based on kind of running the existing products well than it is on creating something new.
They also had those "Is Facebook good for the world?" polls. That
They
sometimes
have actually killed that one internally because at least like they used to have a metric, a survey metric where they would ask people whether they thought content was good for the world. And they stopped that because the implication that perhaps Facebook might be promoting things that was not good for the world was viewed as a little too awkward of a question to have in your hands, if that makes sense. This was all part of the kind of the post-research crackdown that happened after, I think, Frances Haugen demonstrated how much damning material there was internally.
So, final question. Say I'm a lawmaker reading your book, and I want to do something about this, right? I want to instill in this company that they have built this incredibly powerful tool that is shaping people's lives, and maybe those lives are even at stake. And I agree with some of the employees that have spoken with you. What could I do that hasn't been attempted, or even, what could I say? How can this get resolved, if at all, from the outside, or does it have to come from within Meta?
So the debates internally debate about this company has, I think, frequently been mired down in politics, right? The idea being that one party wants to change it in a way that would be detrimental to the other party, and therefore everyone must fight about it. And that's kind of a recipe for gridlock, obviously. I think that I have always found the question of responsibility for recommendation systems and what they do to be an interesting one. I think it's a pretty, Section 230, right, is the law that sort of shields internet platforms' responsibility for user-generated content, was built with a Prodigy bulletin board in mind, right? Not a recommendation system. And so it's always been, again, I don't get into the legal side of things, but I do think in terms of public appreciation and something that would be good for lawmakers and everyone else to think about a bit is what responsibilities platforms have for what they recommend, and whether it is acceptable to be recommending things that you literally don't understand what you're recommending whatsoever. I think very rarely can you think of a circumstance in which, like, unleashing a machine and then saying, oh, well, it's driven by itself now, not my responsibility for what it does, right? Like that doesn't sound like a thing that one would be able to do, but to some degree, that is the way we approach social media regulation. And I think that's an interesting thing to talk about. Again, Section 230, what laws are good? These are beyond my, beyond my scope. But I do think that that looking at design choices and whether those are, say, fair and reasonable to users, and then looking at what recommendation systems do and how they function, those are things that would be really useful. And then finally, I think just transparency. Honestly, like no one will ever be able to get that many internal records out of Meta again, as Frances Haugen did. They have tightened down to the best of their ability. And I think, waiting for reporters to get their hands on things is a pretty terrible way of circulating information to the public. I think it's better than nothing, but like it's not, neither that nor sort of, kind of self-reporting via the platforms seems like a particularly useful approach. I'm talking more about just meta here, right? Is that it seems like there needs to be some level of standardized disclosure of what these platforms are doing. And if there was anything that's, I think, really optimistic coming out of the book project and just sort of all of the Facebook files stuff, it's that there are, like, at this point, there is a large body of former employees who have been trained in truly incredible circumstances with truly incredible data access on how this stuff works, right? There are, at this point, sort of the technocrats of platform mechanics out and wild. And, a lot more of them certainly are speaking their minds these days, right? Like, it's just pretty easy to find someone who wants to talk rec systems, recommendation systems these days, and has some experience with it. Whereas when, I started this beat in 2019, that was, those people were very few and far between, and they were much harder to find.
Well, it's a fascinating book, Broken Code by Jeff Horwitz. Thank you so much for all your time today. And it's been a really great discussion.
Thank you so much for hosting this thing. Thank you, Sarah. Really appreciate it. And also No Filter by Sarah Fryer, released a while back, but still good.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. If you are interested in podcasts about nonfiction books, listen to C-SPAN's Book Notes Plus podcast for interviews with authors and historians hosted by Brian Lamb.